Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the KZ AS24 Pro. Of course, in the background we do have the summer cicadas. They will be joining us for another few weeks and then they will disappear and die off for another decade or two. So do keep that in mind. There will be some noises in the background. That's not me. That is the bugs outside of my house. So we are here to talk about the AS24 Pro, and it looks like this. So very much like the original AS24. I think it's probably the same exact shell. I don't think they've changed the size. I think they just added the Pro, which you can see there. If you had the original AS24 with the 8 switches, consider yourself lucky. The AS24 Pro is back to 4 switches. And again, I think as time went on, I think when KZ first started doing the switches, they were really trying to figure out how to do it, how to make them useful. So every set that has switches, the switches seem to be more meaningful and what changes they make, and AS24 Pro is no different. So I realize that people don't like switches, but with each set and each refinement on the actual changes that they make, they tended to actually get them more useful, more meaningful, and AS24 Pro is no different in that respect. So that's what the shells look like. They are quite large. They are, as I said, no different than the originals. The cable, this is KZ's stock cable, the SPC version. We're not going to talk too much about that. So as I said, AS24, and I'm going to show the original AS24 base version because that's about the closest to the Pro version on the basier side. So as you can see, that the graph's not all that different from one another. Again, I would call this a different flavor on AS24. Definitely a refinement on AS24, but not a radically different set, not a radically different tuning. You can kind of see most of the changes are going to be about out here, how they really brought in the treble, and that has some bonus effects like making it sound more natural, less BA timbre. This style of tuning and the kind of the signature that they use is exactly what that is for. And I would say that is the major change on AS24 Pro is to really bring, and it's not all that unique to this set. There's actually quite a few sets that will follow. We'll take a look at one a little bit later. But, you know, this style, put a little energy here and bring this down a little bit sharper, tends to give you nice vocals, but then avoid sibilance, avoid BA timbre, avoid any unnecessary fatigue out in the treble, and that's exactly what that does. Makes everything sound a little bit more natural in the mid. So yes, I would definitely call the Pro sort of a refinement on what they did with the original AS24. So switches, as I said, the switches have these sort of changes. So now you do get almost 3 useful bass levels, and this is about where they should be. You know, the top one is maybe a bit too much. The bottom one might be a little bit less, and then they have one right in the middle. And I think this is a very, very useful range. And as I said, I think the switches and the values that they chose and how they worked over time, I think they've really zoned in on a set and a useful spread that is actually, you know, sounds good. Even the top one with a little more bass, that's a little bit more fun. If you're really a little bit more critical or like a little bit less bass, they gave you one that fits right there. So again, I think they've really narrowed this down to some useful values. And then on AS24 Pro, they actually do have about 3 levels of treble, which are going to be really hard to see on this, but you can see it online on the Squig. But there's sort of a bass treble, then there's -1 and then -2, and you can kind of see it poking through on the bottom, but that's essentially you kind of get 3 here and 3 here. The rest of it doesn't really start changing, I think, until somewhere around there. So pretty cool. I mean, I think that is actually a pretty useful set for what they shipped with AS24 Pro. No complaints there. It's actually a really nice signature. It's actually a nicer looking graph. It's this modern, controlled, no crazy peakiness outside of my coupler peak there. You know, very much how KZ has been moving lately and recently, and I would call this a very modern style KZ graph. So let's kind of jump into it at the top. So the obvious question on this guy is, so where would I rank the flagships? And I would call the AS24 Pro their newest flagship, and I would still put Hydro as number 1. It's still my favorite set. I still think it's probably the best KZ set that they've ever done, and I think it's going to be a while before anyone topples Hydro. And AS24, very nice set. AS24 Pro, very nice set, but I don't think either of them, for me, topple Hydro. So why? Because Hydro doesn't really give up any performance. This isn't, technically any better than Hydro. It's probably not quite as technical as Hydro, so it doesn't give up any performance. It has some bass to spare. It's still more resolving and technically better to me than AS24 and AS24 Pro. But AS24 Pro does also, it is less complicated than AS24. It has a more general appealing, adjustable tuning. Would I upgrade if I had AS24 to AS24 Pro? I think it's kind of a side grade. It's definitely a refinement on it. Do you necessarily have to spend another $100 to get that small bit of upgrade? Probably not. I think it definitely is more of a side grade, and it's a different flavor on kind of what you already have. So why would you want to buy AS24? There's almost no competition for a full balanced armature set with actual BA based drivers for $100. There's quite a few singles and some doubles and some variants, and there is one that exists out there at around the $100, but I would say there's not many that really do a full BA based implementation the way KZ does it. And KZ will say it competes with more expensive sets, and obviously on the configuration, having 12 balanced armatures with low end, mids, and uppers, true, it does compete against sets that have that configuration, and those are definitely more expensive. But I do think this one is an opportunistic set as well. It's an opportunity for you to purchase a complex all BA set that resembles more expensive sets, but at an affordable price. And that is KZ's sweet spot, right? Giving you a lot of performance, a lot of capability, a lot of technical capability, but doing it at an affordable price. That's exactly what AS24 was. That's exactly what AS24 Pro is as well. So is it a giant killer? No, it's not a giant killer, but it never really had to be a giant killer either. It just had to perform well for the price point, exactly what it does, exactly what AS24 did as well. So I know KZ would love to say it takes on much more expensive sets, and configuration wise, it has a lot of drivers and it sort of does that. But what it really had to do is sound good and deliver on an all BA set that, people can find generally likable. People can try out this sort of driver configuration and get used to it and decide if they want to pursue more expensive sets or not. And that's exactly what AS24 Pro does well. So I would say it's still a little bit complicated. I think the bass and the treble rise with impedance, and I would shoot for about more than 10 ohms of impedance just to get closer to the intended tuning. If you have a near zero set like SMSL and toppings, those are near zero impedance sets. Not quite right for this set as it drops the presence too low and might be a gem for some people, though. I'm going to look at that in a second. So impedance, got right here. So when I first plugged in AS24 Pro into my SMSL, it sounded very much like the Blue Line. Had kind of a conservative bass shelf, but it had a very reduced treble. It sounded quite low, and I couldn't quite figure it out. And I really took a shot at EQing this, trying to figure out why it was sounding not as upper range balanced as it should. It didn't really make any sense. And you kind of look at the graph and you're like, well, yeah, it's kind of rolled off maybe slightly early, but that's not what you really hear. You kind of hear this little bit here. This presence region is a little bit too low at near zero impedance. So KZ's graph, if you look on their website, it actually resembles the one in red. And that's about, so I used a 35 ohm adapter. I think they use a 30 ohm adapter, but there should be about a 5 dB increase to get it to about where KZ shows it should be, what the intended tuning is. And that's why I said you probably less than 1, you're probably a little bit too low. At about 10, you're probably in the midpoint. If you want to hit the intended tuning, you're probably in the 30 range. So do take that into consideration, what you hear. If it does sound a little bit too not present, a little bit too low, not quite as clear as it should be, you might want to buy an adapter. You might want to change your source into something that has a little bit more impedance. But just, I'm not saying go out and buy an impedance adapter, but do be aware of what you're hearing and try to figure out where you are between these two. That's sort of what I did and how I figured out what was going on. So why are there switches to reduce the treble, right? And a lot of it is because of what I just talked about. The treble is rising a little bit more than the bass. The switches give you the ability to fine-tune that treble back down. So again, like I said, you're essentially they're saying the impedance should be about up here. Perhaps that is slightly bright for you, maybe not. I think it was actually pretty fine for me in most cases. But if you do want to back down, you do have the option of I think 1 and 2 to come off of the red line. And I think that was a great fine-tuning adjustment of the curve that they provided. If you are listening to it on a very low impedance device, you're like, there's no way that I need switches to drop it down low because it's already super low. So do be aware that those switches to reduce the treble are basically assuming that you are at the upper band, the red range, and that's what you're listening to. If you're listening to it, like when I first started listening to it, I'm like, I couldn't figure it out because I was listening to it at the blue range. I'm like, it made no sense why they had switches to lower the treble when it was already super low. So to be aware of that as well. Like if you get the feeling that there's no way you should be lowering the treble from where it is, you're probably a little bit lower than what they intended. So something else to think about when you're listening to AS24 Pro. So the fit, now I'll say this one, like I said, the shell is probably about the same as what it is on the other AS24s and even some of their other sets. Even Hydro was kind of a big shell too. This is one of the few where I noticed there was a pressure buildup on my left side. I don't know if it's because I was traveling, because of the humidity, whatever it is. It was much more noticeable on this set than I have on. It's been a long time since I've actually felt pressure, and I did on this one. So not saying you will feel pressure, but I definitely felt it, so I felt obligated to talk about it. And I think there is a vent hole right there too. So I'm not sure if maybe it's just not big enough. Maybe mine's slightly blocked. I'm not sure what it was. Maybe my ears were in not a great feeling for the past couple weeks from traveling, but whatever it was, I definitely noticed a little bit of pressure buildup there. So sound, I would say it's more like a warm U. It's kind of the current low fun version of dropping that big U-shaped curve like you've seen. And we'll kind of look at it here. So we talk about the U-shape pretty often, and the U-shape tends to follow the Harman curve. It tends to drop the mid bass down to the floor right here at about 200, and you can kind of see that KZ actually gave you a little energy at 200, and that's not really the current trend. The current trend is to really drop this down, so there is a little bit more mid bass, there is a little bit more impact, there is a little bit more warmth to it, and again, that sort of helps balance out the BA timbre, something that people complain about in the past. So a little bit here, make things sound a little bit more fuller, more natural, more impactful. The right move, and then bringing this down a little bit early again, where KZ's BAs tend to sound right is a little bit early, and that's exactly what they did, and it really gets rid of a lot of that BA timbre that people have talked about in the past. So kind of the right move on both sides on the U-shape, but yeah, I'll still call it a U-shape. It's it's definitely a UV because they brought a little bit more energy in a little bit later. So but yeah, slightly pleasing, warmer sound, fuller sound, and it lets the bass have some impact, and I think those are all the right moves to do. And on the bass, again, like I said, one of the attractions of these KZ full BA sets has been the bass driver. It's been that way for a couple years. They've actually done BA bass drivers very well. They're very solid, and this set is really no different. And as I've said on many sets at this price point where there's not that many sets at this price point where you could hear BA bass drivers. This happens to be one of them. I do like the switches. That really gives you the opportunity to hear lighter bass and a little bit more textured. And to hear that on BA is something unique. Again, at this price point, you don't hear that many all BA sets with bass texture, and this one gives you 3 switches, and you can kind of roll through something that's a little bit more textured, a little bit more present at the upper end, just a little bit more fun sound. And again, I think that range that they picked that got refined on AS24 Pro is the right range, and it's actually very good. It definitely gives you a more serious or more fun sound. Either way, KZ's bass BAs have been solid for quite a while. No different here. There's a bit more slam than rumble. Again, these tend to be tend to be a little bit, more mid bass. Not focused, but they tend to have a little bit more energy in the mid bass, and then it kind of drifts away or kind of rolls off in the sub bass. And this one's no different. It sort of extends linearly. If you're expecting a big rise in the sub bass, so it rumbles really hard, it doesn't really do that. It sort of rumbles, but at a linear it doesn't rise. It just kind of linearly rumbles out, and it's kind of exactly what it should do. I have no complaints. That's exactly what I like to hear. But a big part of the attraction of AS24 is definitely going to be hearing BA bass drivers at $100. I think it's sort of interesting to me. And I know, like, as I said, there's singles and doubles. Like, you can get 1 BA sets and 2 BA sets. Those are sort of around, but getting a full BA bass driver at an affordable price is actually pretty cool. And the mids and treble, and I'll talk about these together because of the treble. The way they did the treble here influences most of the mids. The way this kind of rolls off in this way is very much going to dictate how the mids sound, and how technical the mid sound or how natural the mid sound. A lot of that is sort of dictated in this curve, and how much energy, where the energy is and where the energy is not. And that's exactly what happens on AS24 Pro versus the original one. Actually carried out a little bit more energy, and it will sound a little bit more technical and a little bit more resolving for that reason. This one was sort of brought back in, not a unique move for KZ. It's a very popular move, but I will say, going back to Hydro and the original AS24, they definitely carried a little bit more treble energy. Those will sound a little bit more resolving, more extended, sound a little bit bigger in stage, and a little bit more transparent. AS24 and the Pro version, they do sound resolving, but neither really amp scales like Hydro. And again, this is sort of one of the reasons why I really like Hydro, and why it's going to be very hard and difficult for KZ to come out with a set that really sounds better than Hydro, because Hydro is very unique in the way it scales with amps. And those of you with very fine gear will sort of notice that Hydro is a very different set compared to every other KZ set. And the AS24s are sort of no different. They sound very resolving, but not in the way that Hydro does. And I will sort of stand by that and say, Hydro is still going to be technically better, more resolving, better layering, better separation. It's technically better than AS24 Pro, and I like it for that reason. But where AS24 does really well, they really pulled back that treble, so it is more natural sounding. It has better timbre, less BA timbre, no sibilance, no fatigue. Those are things that you don't find on KZ sets all that often. And again, it's this slight move that they did in the treble that doesn't look all that much on the graph, and especially because mine isn't going to be super accurate out in this area. But pulling this back just a little bit so you don't notice the sibilance, you don't notice those hard S's. They didn't carry out the 15K or 13K, which they typically do, and throw a lot of energy out there and say, we have great BAs and they could do super extension. They didn't do that on AS24. AS24 is actually a very mature version, right? So a little bit lower here and then drop this off. So it's a very natural roll off in the treble, and it sounds kind of like maybe like your Meyer audio sets. And if we look at, like I said, at the lower, if we look at the lower impedance version, so if you happen to have a sub 1 ohm version of your source, and you look at it against something like Juzier Butterfly, right? They both have the same timbre focused signature. So you can look at it and say, well, there's a little bit more mid bass there, and that's fine, that's more fun. But actually, when you look at the treble and at the lower impedance version, you can kind of see these sort of track. And as I said, this is going to be the one problem about doing this, is the presence, this 4 to 5K area on AS24 is just a little bit low at low impedance. If you just poke this up in EQ or do it some other way, you'll actually get pretty close to this timbre style, hybrid style that Butterfly is actually quite good at. And you can kind of see they basically roll off in the same way. And that is a very familiar sound for those of you who like those sets from that brand. So yeah, I think KZ will sort of accidentally hit on something that was, I knew listening to AS24 Pro that it was in the style of a timbre focus as opposed to a technical focus. They didn't really push the BAs forward so you could hear details and resolution, all that stuff. It wasn't like that. Butterfly isn't like that either. And when you try to get BAs to sound more natural and closer to your dynamic drivers, no dynamic drivers in AS24, but it's the same idea. Their bass drivers sound a little bit more like dynamic drivers. And when you bring these two closer and the coherence gets really tight, you end up with a very natural, nice timbre style set along the lines of Butterfly. That is kind of where AS24, why you want to buy it. what makes AS24 a little bit different than the other ones. This is pretty much exactly what it is. At the higher end of impedance, you're going to be, quite a bit above Butterfly, but it's something to think about because not everyone's going to be at 30 ohms. You might be a little bit closer to it, but I did think that was super interesting. Just looking at the two side by side, and for me, they basically sound very, very similar in that way, in their focus on timbre as opposed to, I would say that they're all very much focused on being more natural. A little bit, they're going to be a little bit less resolving, a little bit less separated, a little bit less layered. Definitely a timbre versus tech trade-off, and that's kind of exactly where AS24 fits compared to, or the Pro fits, as opposed to the original or Hydro in that way. It's just kind of something that sounds more general appealing, a little bit more natural. That's exactly where it fits. So the treble reduction switches are real, and again, this is going to kind of feed right into the balance of resolving versus better timbre. If you pull the treble down a little bit more, it's going to sound a little bit less resolving, but perhaps a little bit more natural for you. Perhaps that'll be better timbre. Definitely play with the treble switches, the last two. They will make a difference. They will be noticeable. If you notice your track has a little sharp point to it, definitely push it down one. I probably wouldn't push it down two, but definitely start with one and see how that works. And I kind of went back and forth on where the treble settings were, and I played with them quite a bit more than the bass, because the bass, I think at the lower setting on the bass, I think it's actually quite fine. I think along the lines of this signature, having it sound a little bit cleaner with the lower bass shelf, I thought that was actually kind of fine on this one. It's definitely more fun with more bass, but with the treble setting, I think the two were in balance at some point with the lower bass setting, so that's kind of where I stuck with it. So stage with the most treble, with the most treble, most bass, but not as nice as Hydro's height, right? So I think, again, this is another one where I think Hydro does a really, really good job. Hydro has a little bit more treble, has a little bit more space, has a little bit more depth. It actually does all three dimensions quite well. This one's going to be just kind of has nice width and has some nice width and height, but it doesn't quite have the depth. It doesn't quite have the 3D feel of Hydro. It's kind of okay there, but the way they do the treble, again, that's not going to be so super conducive to a big stage, and it's kind of what falls through when you listen to it. But, again, not really the primary focus on this one. It was more about being natural, and they did that quite well. So that is what I got on AS24 Pro. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.